Joining me now is Mimi Rocah. She's a former U.S. attorney and an NBC News legal analyst. Mimi, taking the 30,000-foot view, Trump is the subject of a criminal investigation that is probing his campaign. Michael Cohen has a recorded conversation with Donald Trump during the campaign. Everything points to there being more recordings. Earlier today, you said this was just the tip of the iceberg. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant, Katie, is that, as you said, there likely are more recordings. And this one may be 2 minutes long, but we don't know how long the other ones are. And even if there aren't other recordings, any recording is like a smoking gun in the sense that if Michael Cohen becomes a signed-up cooperator and he is someday on the stand or in an affidavit, telling a story about events that occurred between him and Trump and others, the prosecutors will need what's called corroboration. That's the key to any criminal case. And a recording of Michael Cohen and Trump talking about anything, really, will likely corroborate things that Michael Cohen is telling them, telling the prosecutors. And so it can become very valuable. It is very valuable evidence that prosecutors can use to corroborate not just what's specifically on the recording, which sounds here like it's going to be important, but also just to bolster the credibility of the witness in general so that a jury or others believe other things that that witness is telling you. So it's a very important piece of evidence.
So the description of the tape that we have is from mostly from Rudy Giuliani, talking about how they were talking about a payment to Karen McDougal, and they were talking about writing her a check instead of sending her cash. Ultimately, that didn't happen because the National Enquirer ended up buying her story and giving her a contract in return that she says they did not fulfill. The legal ramifications of that conversation, what are they?
Well, first of all, just because they did not, meaning Trump and Cohen did not pay Karen McDougal, but somebody else did, doesn't take them out of the equation. I think that's what Giuliani's trying to say now, that this is exculpatory because he talked about it, but then they didn't write the check, the National Enquirer did. That's not how the law works. If they were trying to come up with a scheme to pay her off, to keep her quiet, and somebody else is part of that scheme but ultimately wrote the check, they're still part of that scheme. So first of all, as everyone's been talking about, there's this possible campaign finance violation. And again, it doesn't really matter who wrote the check or paid the cash. You can be part of a conspiracy, you can be part of a scheme if you're part of the planning of it, even if you don't actually hand over the money. And then there's likely some kind of fraud claim here. I mean, in short, Karen McDougal got scammed, right? She was told she was being paid for one thing, and that didn't turn out to be true. So, this tape in and of itself probably isn't going to prove all of that, but it just sounds like it's one step closer to this theory that a lot of people have been talking about being true, and that Cohen possesses information about it. And that's the other piece of the iceberg I was talking about.
Maybe one other thing. Why would a lawyer record a 2-minute conversation?
Well, as we've said before, a legitimate lawyer, a real lawyer wouldn't. But Michael Cohen was not acting as Donald Trump's real lawyer. We've been saying he was his fixer. He was really more of a businessman, a helper. And for anyone, why does anyone record people's conversations? Well, they do it because they know they're up to no good, and they want to make sure that they have something later if they need it. It's kind of like an insurance policy.
Mimi, this is not a Mueller investigation. This is an SDNY investigation. SDNY has these tapes. If the SDNY comes across something that is pertinent to the Mueller investigation, is there a system in place where they hand it off to the Mueller investigation? How does that work?
Absolutely. I mean, you often have coordination between different federal prosecutorial offices, but certainly here where there's this much at stake, there's no question in my mind that they would work with Mueller's team. I just want to go back really quickly, if I could, to something John said. I can tell you right now the Southern District did not leak this, nor do I think the FBI did. I don't know who did, but there is a theory out there that Giuliani did because it's to distract from the horrible news about, Putin and Trump.
So here's some horrible news about Putin and Trump. Here's some other horrible news.
Let's change it by bringing back the who he slept with story.
It's so ridiculous.
Yeah, well, and that may not be it, but I just want to remind people, and this is sort of to your question, that Cohen is not necessarily separate from the whole Russia conspiracy collusion scandal. Remember, Cohen was working on Trump's behalf until much later than anyone had previously thought on getting him the Trump Tower deal in Moscow. And part of what people, that there's some indications that if Putin has leverage over Trump, it has to do with his finances. So this all could be tied together, and that's to your point.
You were getting to the next point I wanted to make. If anybody knows about Russia, and anybody is going to have information that could be interesting to Robert Mueller about Russia, it's Michael Cohen. But Robert Mueller has not compelled Michael Cohen to testify. He hasn't subpoenaed him. There's been no interview. Michael Cohen has not been touched by Robert Mueller. Why not?
Well, because Mueller's smart and strategic, and there was a separate case here to very legitimately bring in the Southern District of New York. There's all sorts of things to look at that aren't within Mueller's purview, and he's going to let that play out and see, because you'd much rather have Cohen as a cooperator than as a subpoenaed witness to the grand jury. You will get much more information that way, and it looks like this may be working out that way, and the strategy may be absolutely correct.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.